Question 1. During the evaluation of a client's requirement for a highly available and resilient storage solution for their critical business applications, which design approach for a FlexPod architecture best ensures the elimination of single points of failure and maintains data accessibility during component failures? Option A. Configure the Cisco UCS environment with single fabric interconnects and single network uplinks from the NetApp storage, assuming the NetApp's dual controllers will compensate for network and compute redundancy gaps. Option B. Design the FlexPod with redundant NetApp controllers, but utilize a single network path for storage traffic and single fabric interconnects in the Cisco UCS, prioritizing cost savings over complete redundancy. Option C. Deploy a single NetApp storage controller with a single network connection to the Cisco UCS environment, relying on the inherent resilience of the applications to handle storage outages. Option D. Implement a FlexPod solution with dual NetApp storage controllers in a clustered configuration, redundant network connections utilizing VPC from Cisco UCS, and redundant UCS fabric interconnects, ensuring all critical components have active-passive or active-active redundancy. The correct answer is D. Implement a FlexPod solution with dual NetApp storage controllers in a clustered configuration, redundant network connections utilizing VPC from Cisco UCS, and redundant UCS fabric interconnects, ensuring all critical components have active-passive or active-active redundancy. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in IT infrastructure design, where a client requires a highly available and resilient storage solution for critical business applications. The challenge lies in balancing the client's performance and availability demands with the inherent complexities and potential failure points of distributed systems. Understanding the nuances of data protection, network dependencies, and the specific capabilities of the FlexPod architecture is crucial for making an informed design decision that meets both technical and business objectives. The need to avoid single points of failure and ensure data integrity under various failure conditions adds significant complexity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves designing a FlexPod solution that leverages the integrated capabilities of NetApp storage and Cisco UCS for high availability. This includes implementing redundant network paths, dual controllers for the NetApp storage array, and ensuring that the Cisco UCS compute infrastructure is configured with redundant components and fabric interconnects. Specifically, utilizing NetApp's HA features like clustered data ONTAP with multiple nodes and appropriate RAID configurations, alongside Cisco's VPC, Virtual Port Channel, for network redundancy, and UCS's redundant power supplies and fan modules, directly addresses the requirement for eliminating single points of failure. This aligns with best practices for enterprise-class data center design, emphasizing resilience and fault tolerance, which are implicitly or explicitly mandated by general IT best practices, and often by client SLAs that require specific uptime guarantees. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to deploy a single NetApp storage controller with a single network connection to the Cisco UCS environment. This creates a critical single point of failure. If the storage controller fails or the network link is disrupted, the entire storage system becomes inaccessible, leading to application downtime and data unavailability, which would violate typical service-level agreements and client expectations for a high-availability solution. Another incorrect approach would be to configure the Cisco UCS environment with single fabric interconnects and single network uplinks from the NetApp storage. This introduces redundancy gaps in the compute and network layers. While the NetApp might have dual controllers, a failure in a single fabric interconnect or uplink would still lead to connectivity loss for a portion of the compute or storage resources, compromising the overall availability of the solution. A third incorrect approach would be to overlook the importance of proper network configuration for internode communication within the NetApp cluster and between the storage and compute. Inadequate network segmentation or bandwidth for storage traffic can lead to performance degradation and potential instability, even if hardware redundancy is present. This can indirectly impact availability by causing applications to become unresponsive. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this by first thoroughly understanding the client's specific availability and performance requirements, including recovery point objectives, RPO, and recovery time objectives, RTO. This involves detailed discussions about critical applications and their tolerance for downtime. Next, they must leverage their knowledge of the FlexPod architecture's integrated components, NetApp storage and Cisco UCS, and their respective high-availability features. The design process should follow a layered approach, ensuring redundancy at the storage controller level, network connectivity level including switches and uplinks, and compute level. A risk assessment should be performed to identify potential single points of failure and design mitigation strategies. Finally, thorough testing and validation of the implemented high-availability features are essential before deployment to confirm that the solution meets the defined requirements. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows that for the proposed FlexPod design, a critical step involves assessing its potential impact on existing data governance policies and operational resilience frameworks. Which of the following approaches best aligns with U.S. regulatory expectations for such an assessment? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the FlexPod's technical specifications against current data privacy regulations, e.g., CCPA, GLBA, and assess its integration with existing business continuity and disaster recovery plans, documenting any identified gaps and proposing specific remediation steps. Option B. Engage a third-party vendor to perform a high-level overview of the FlexPod's compliance posture without detailed analysis of its specific interaction with internal policies, relying on the vendor's general attestations. Option C. Focus primarily on the performance benchmarks of the FlexPod, ensuring it meets or exceeds established service level agreements, and assume that compliance with data governance and operational resilience is implicitly covered by existing IT infrastructure documentation. Option D. Defer the detailed impact assessment of data governance and operational resilience until after the FlexPod has been fully deployed and is in production to gather real-world performance data. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the FlexPod's technical specifications against current data privacy regulations, e.g., CCPA, GLBA, and assess its integration with existing business continuity and disaster recovery plans, documenting any identified gaps and proposing specific remediation steps. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of how to conduct an impact assessment for a FlexPod design within the specific regulatory framework governing financial services technology in the United States. The challenge lies in balancing the need for robust technological solutions with compliance obligations, particularly concerning data privacy, security, and operational resilience. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure that the impact assessment not only identifies potential risks, but also proposes mitigation strategies that align with regulatory expectations and ethical standards. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and proactive assessment that directly addresses the requirements of relevant U.S. regulations, such as those from the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency (OCC), which often mandate thorough risk assessments for technology deployments. This approach involves engaging all relevant stakeholders, including IT, compliance, legal, and business units, to ensure a holistic view of potential impacts. It also emphasizes the documentation of findings and mitigation plans, which is crucial for auditability and demonstrating due diligence to regulators. Ethical considerations are met by ensuring that the design prioritizes customer data protection and system integrity, thereby fostering trust and maintaining market stability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the technical performance metrics of the FlexPod design, without adequately considering regulatory compliance and potential downstream impacts on data privacy or operational continuity, would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would violate regulatory expectations for a holistic risk assessment and could expose the organization to significant fines, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. Another incorrect approach might involve a superficial review of compliance documentation without a deep dive into how the FlexPod design specifically interacts with or potentially challenges existing controls. This oversight could lead to noncompliance with regulations like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, or the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, if data security or financial reporting controls are compromised. A third incorrect approach could be to defer the impact assessment until after the FlexPod design is implemented, which is a clear violation of proactive risk management principles mandated by regulators and an abdication of professional responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the scope of the impact assessment based on the specific technology and the regulatory landscape. Second, identify all relevant stakeholders and ensure their active participation. Third, systematically identify potential risks across technical, operational, compliance, and business domains. Fourth, evaluate the severity and likelihood of these risks and develop appropriate mitigation strategies. Fifth, document the entire process, including findings, recommendations, and implementation plans. Finally, establish a mechanism for ongoing monitoring and review to ensure continued compliance and effectiveness. Question 3. The risk matrix shows a critical vulnerability in the FlexPod storage system that could lead to a significant data breach, though the likelihood of exploitation is assessed as low. The sales team relies heavily on this system for real-time customer data access, and any downtime would severely impact their ability to close deals. Management is pushing for a quick resolution that minimizes disruption to sales operations. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Defer patching the vulnerability indefinitely, given the low likelihood of exploitation and the high impact of sales disruption. Option B. Implement a temporary workaround that isolates the affected component, while scheduling the patch for the next planned maintenance window after a thorough impact assessment and stakeholder approval. Option C. Apply the patch immediately without further assessment, accepting the risk of temporary sales disruption to eliminate the critical vulnerability. Option D. Immediately halt all sales operations and apply the patch to the FlexPod system, prioritizing security over short-term business impact. Correct answer is B. Implement a temporary workaround that isolates the affected component, while scheduling the patch for the next planned maintenance window after a thorough impact assessment and stakeholder approval. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a critical business function with the long-term implications of a security vulnerability. The risk matrix highlights a high-impact, low-probability event, which can be difficult to prioritize against more frequent, lower-impact issues. The pressure to maintain service availability for a key stakeholder group, the sales team, adds a layer of urgency that could lead to rushed or incomplete decision-making. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to a structured, risk-based methodology for addressing security vulnerabilities. By prioritizing remediation based on the potential impact and likelihood of exploitation, and by involving relevant stakeholders in the decision-making process, it ensures that resources are allocated effectively and that business continuity is maintained without compromising security posture. This aligns with general IT governance principles and the spirit of regulatory frameworks that mandate risk management and due diligence in protecting sensitive data and systems. Specifically, it reflects a proactive stance on cybersecurity, which is increasingly expected by regulators and auditors. An incorrect approach that involves deferring the patch indefinitely without a formal risk acceptance process is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the potential for the vulnerability to be exploited, even if the probability is deemed low. It creates an unacceptable level of technical debt and exposes the organization to significant risk, potentially violating regulatory requirements for data protection and system integrity. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately halt all sales operations to apply the patch without assessing the business impact or exploring alternative mitigation strategies, is also professionally unsound. This demonstrates a lack of business acumen and an inability to balance security needs with operational requirements, potentially causing severe financial and reputational damage. It also fails to consider less disruptive, yet effective interim solutions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the vulnerability and its potential impact. 2. Assessing the likelihood of exploitation in the current environment. 3. Evaluating the business impact of both the vulnerability and potential remediation actions. 4. Consulting with relevant stakeholders, IT security business units management. 5. Developing a range of mitigation options, including patching, workarounds, or formal risk acceptance with compensating controls. 6. Documenting the decision and the rationale behind it. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with organizational objectives and regulatory obligations. Question 4. Regulatory review indicates that a financial services firm is planning to deploy a FlexPod solution in a hybrid cloud environment to manage sensitive customer data. The firm operates globally and must adhere to varying data protection laws across different jurisdictions. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements for data privacy and security in this complex deployment? Option A. Implement a comprehensive data governance framework that includes data classification, anonymization techniques where appropriate, robust encryption for data at rest and in transit, and detailed data processing agreements with the cloud provider that explicitly address data sovereignty and breach notification. Option B. Focus primarily on the technical performance and integration capabilities of the FlexPod solution, with a secondary consideration for data security measures only after the system is fully operational. Option C. Rely on the firm's existing internal IT security policies, assuming they are sufficient to protect data in a cloud environment, without specific adaptation for the FlexPod deployment or the cloud provider's infrastructure. Option D. Prioritize the selection of a cloud provider based on cost-effectiveness and readily available scalability, assuming their standard data processing agreements will cover all necessary compliance aspects. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the selection of a cloud provider based on cost-effectiveness and readily available scalability, assuming their standard data processing agreements will cover all necessary compliance aspects. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in navigating the nuances of data privacy regulations within the context of cloud-based FlexPod design. The core difficulty lies in balancing the benefits of cloud scalability and accessibility with the stringent requirements for data protection and cross-border data transfer. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance without unduly hindering business operations or compromising data integrity. The need to interpret and apply specific clauses related to data sovereignty, consent, and security measures in a rapidly evolving technological landscape adds to the complexity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a comprehensive understanding of the applicable regulatory framework, specifically the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, if the exam jurisdiction is the EU or equivalent national data protection laws. This involves a thorough assessment of the data types to be stored, the geographical locations of data processing and storage, and the potential risks associated with cloud deployment. Best practice dictates implementing robust data anonymization or pseudonymization techniques where feasible, establishing clear data processing agreements with cloud providers that explicitly address security and compliance obligations, and ensuring mechanisms for data subject rights are maintained. This approach aligns with the ethical imperative to protect individual privacy and the regulatory requirement to demonstrate accountability for data processing activities. Correct approach is analysis, an approach that focuses solely on the technical capabilities of the FlexPod design without adequately considering the regulatory implications of data storage and processing locations, would be a significant regulatory failure. This overlooks the extraterritorial reach of data protection laws and the potential for noncompliance if data is transferred to or processed in jurisdictions with inadequate data protection standards. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that standard cloud provider terms of service automatically satisfy all data protection obligations. This is a critical ethical and regulatory failure, as it abdicates responsibility for due diligence and places undue reliance on a third party without verification. Professionals are obligated to ensure that contractual agreements specifically address the nuances of data protection, including data breach notification procedures and the right to audit. Finally, an approach that neglects to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures for data security, such as encryption at rest and in transit, access controls, and regular security audits, would constitute a severe regulatory and ethical lapse. This directly contravenes the principles of data minimization and integrity, exposing sensitive data to unauthorized access or loss, and failing to meet the security of the processing requirement mandated by most data protection frameworks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, starting with a clear identification of all applicable data protection regulations based on the location of the data subjects and the intended processing activities. This should be followed by a detailed data inventory and mapping exercise to understand the nature and sensitivity of the data. Subsequently, a thorough assessment of cloud provider capabilities and contractual terms against regulatory requirements is essential. Implementing a layered security strategy, including technical controls and robust contractual safeguards, alongside ongoing monitoring and compliance checks, forms the bedrock of professional decision-making in such scenarios. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that a new FlexPod design, intended to enhance data processing speeds, has been provisionally implemented across several key client-facing systems, without a comprehensive review of its adherence to the firm's established data governance policies and U.S. regulatory requirements for financial data handling. The implementation team cites significant performance improvements as justification for bypassing a full compliance assessment. Which of the following actions best represent the appropriate professional response to this situation? Option A. Rely on the vendor's assurances that the FlexPod design meets all relevant industry standards and U.S. financial regulations, and continue with the planned expansion of its use. Option B. Conduct a limited, informal review of the FlexPod design's basic security features, focusing only on immediate operational risks, and approve its continued use based on the implementation team's positive feedback. Option C. Proceed with the full rollout of the new FlexPod design, as the performance benefits are critical for client satisfaction, and address any potential compliance issues reactively as they arise. Option D. Immediately halt all operations on the new FlexPod design and initiate a full retrospective compliance audit involving legal, compliance, and IT security teams to ensure alignment with SEC, FINRA, and GLBA regulations before any further use. The correct answer is D. Immediately halt all operations on the new FlexPod design and initiate a full retrospective compliance audit involving legal, compliance, and IT security teams to ensure alignment with SEC, FINRA, and GLBA regulations before any further use. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for rapid deployment of new technology and the imperative to maintain data integrity and regulatory compliance. The core issue is ensuring that the FlexPod design, while innovative, adheres to the specific data handling and security requirements mandated by the relevant regulatory framework for financial services in the U.S. The challenge lies in balancing the perceived benefits of the new design against potential risks that may not be immediately apparent without thorough due diligence. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and documented review process that aligns with U.S. regulatory expectations for financial institutions. Specifically, it acknowledges the need to validate the FlexPod design against established data governance policies, security protocols, and compliance mandates such as those outlined by the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, and FINRA, Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. This approach ensures that any new technology is implemented in a manner that safeguards client data, maintains audit trails, and prevents potential breaches or non-compliance, thereby upholding the fiduciary duty owed to clients and the integrity of the financial markets. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the perceived performance gains without adequate validation would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate regulations requiring robust risk management frameworks and due diligence on technology implementations. For instance, failing to assess the impact on data privacy could contravene regulations like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, or state-specific data breach notification laws. Similarly, overlooking potential security vulnerabilities in the new design could lead to breaches that violate the SEC's Regulation SB, Privacy of Consumer Financial Information, or FINRA Rule 4511, General Supervision. Another incorrect approach, such as implementing the design based on vendor assurances alone without independent verification, would fail to meet the standard of care expected of financial professionals and could expose the firm to significant legal and reputational risks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This includes identifying potential regulatory touchpoints, evaluating the impact of the proposed design on existing compliance controls, and conducting thorough testing and validation. Professionals should always seek to document their due diligence, obtain necessary approvals from compliance and legal departments, and ensure that any new technology is integrated in a way that demonstrably meets or exceeds regulatory requirements. The principle of innocent until proven guilty does not apply to technology adoption in regulated environments. Rather, a proactive and cautious approach is mandated. Question 6. Compliance review shows that the new FlexPod design project is nearing its final implementation phase. The project team has focused heavily on achieving optimal performance metrics and cost efficiencies. However, there is a concern that certain aspects of data handling and access controls within the proposed design may not fully align with the latest data privacy and security regulations. Which of the following approaches best ensures regulatory adherence for this FlexPod design? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive post-implementation audit to identify and rectify any compliance gaps before the system goes live. Option B. Prioritize the completion of the project on time and within budget, addressing any identified compliance issues in a subsequent, less time-sensitive phase. Option C. Immediately halt the project to conduct a thorough review of all design components against current regulatory requirements, making necessary adjustments before proceeding. Option D. Integrate a dedicated compliance review into the final stages of testing and validation, ensuring that all data handling and access control mechanisms meet regulatory standards before deployment. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive post-implementation audit to identify and rectify any compliance gaps before the system goes live. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the implementation of a new FlexPod design within a regulated financial services environment. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient and effective technology deployment with the stringent requirements of regulatory compliance, specifically concerning data integrity, security, and auditability. The pressure to deliver a project on time and within budget can create a temptation to bypass or minimize certain compliance-related steps, which could have severe consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all regulatory obligations are met without compromising the project's objectives. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and integrated strategy for compliance throughout the FlexPod design and implementation lifecycle. This means embedding compliance considerations from the initial design phases, conducting thorough risk assessments that specifically address regulatory requirements, and ensuring that all testing and validation activities explicitly verify adherence to relevant laws and guidelines. This approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principle of compliance by design, which is a cornerstone of regulatory frameworks in financial services. It demonstrates a commitment to preventing breaches rather than reacting to them, thereby safeguarding client data, maintaining market integrity, and avoiding potential penalties. Specifically, it adheres to guidelines that mandate robust data protection, secure system architecture, and comprehensive audit trails, ensuring that the FlexPod design is not only technically sound, but also legally defensible and operationally secure. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing a reactive compliance strategy, where checks are only performed after the design is finalized or during a post-implementation audit, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach ignores the principle of proactive risk management and increases the likelihood of discovering non-compliance late in the process, leading to costly rework, project delays, and potential regulatory sanctions. It fails to meet the spirit and letter of regulations that require ongoing vigilance and integration of compliance measures. Focusing solely on technical performance metrics without adequately assessing the regulatory implications of the design choices is another failure. While performance is important, it cannot supersede the obligation to protect sensitive data, ensure system resilience against cyber threats, or maintain accurate and accessible audit logs as mandated by regulatory bodies. This approach risks creating a system that is efficient but non-compliant, exposing the organization to legal liabilities and reputational damage. Adopting a minimum viable compliance approach, where only the most obvious or easily verifiable regulatory requirements are addressed, is also professionally unacceptable. This suggests a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the comprehensive nature of regulatory frameworks. It implies a willingness to operate in a gray area, which is inherently risky and can lead to unforeseen compliance gaps and enforcement actions. Ethical considerations are also compromised, as this approach prioritizes expediency over the fundamental duty to protect clients and uphold regulatory standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, proactive approach to compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory landscape applicable to the technology and the business operations. 2. Integrating compliance requirements into the project lifecycle from inception, not as an afterthought. 3. Conducting thorough and ongoing risk assessments that identify potential compliance gaps. 4. Implementing robust testing and validation procedures that specifically verify adherence to regulatory mandates. 5. Maintaining comprehensive documentation and audit trails to demonstrate compliance. 6. Fostering a culture of compliance where all team members understand their responsibilities. 7. Seeking expert advice when in doubt about specific regulatory interpretations or technical implementations. Question 7. Implementation of a new FlexPod investment strategy, recommended by a client for its potential for aggressive growth, is being considered by a financial advisor. The advisor has identified that this strategy, while potentially high reward, carries substantial undisclosed risks that are not aligned with the client's stated moderate risk tolerance. The client is insistent on proceeding, emphasizing their desire for rapid capital appreciation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Implement the FlexPod strategy as requested by the client, assuming the client's insistence implies full understanding and acceptance of all associated risks. Option B. Proceed with the FlexPod strategy, ensuring all potential risks are clearly communicated to the client in writing, and obtain explicit client acknowledgement of these risks before execution. Option C. Modify the FlexPod strategy slightly to mitigate some of the most extreme risks, while still aiming for aggressive growth, and present this revised strategy to the client. Option D. Decline to implement the FlexPod strategy and suggest an alternative investment that aligns with the client's risk tolerance and financial goals, explaining the rationale for the refusal. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the FlexPod strategy, ensuring all potential risks are clearly communicated to the client in writing, and obtain explicit client acknowledgement of these risks before execution. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a classic ethical dilemma where a financial advisor, acting under the 500-170 FlexPod design regulatory framework, is pressured by a client to implement a strategy that, while potentially lucrative in the short term, carries significant undisclosed risks. The challenge lies in balancing the advisor's duty to act in the client's best interest and to provide suitable advice, against the client's explicit instructions and the potential for increased business. The advisor must navigate the conflict between client autonomy and professional responsibility, ensuring that any recommendation aligns with regulatory requirements for suitability and disclosure. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment and transparent communication. The advisor must explain the inherent risks of the proposed FlexPod strategy, even if the client is insistent, and document this discussion. If the risks are deemed too high or unsuitable for the client's profile, the advisor has a professional and regulatory obligation to decline the recommendation or the transaction, or to propose an alternative that better aligns with the client's risk tolerance and financial objectives. This upholds the principles of fiduciary duty and suitability, as mandated by the 500-170 FlexPod design framework, which prioritizes client protection and informed decision-making. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the strategy without fully disclosing the risks to the client is a direct violation of disclosure requirements and the duty of care. This approach prioritizes client satisfaction over client protection, potentially leading to significant financial harm for the client and regulatory sanctions for the advisor. It fails to meet the suitability standards inherent in the 500-170 FlexPod design framework. Accepting the client's instruction without further due diligence or explanation, assuming the client is fully informed, is also problematic. While client autonomy is important, the advisor has a responsibility to ensure the client's understanding and that the proposed strategy is genuinely suitable. This approach abdicates the advisor's professional judgment and regulatory obligations, suggesting a slightly modified but still high-risk strategy without addressing the core concerns of the original proposal is a form of window dressing. It attempts to appear compliant while still pushing a strategy that may not be in the client's best interest, failing to provide genuine suitability and transparency. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that prioritizes client welfare and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the client's objectives and risk tolerance. 2. Thoroughly evaluating any proposed strategy against these parameters. 3. Clearly and comprehensively disclosing all material risks and benefits. 4. Documenting all advice and client interactions. 5. Being prepared to decline a transaction or recommendation if it is deemed unsuitable or non-compliant, even if it means losing a client or a deal. Question 8. The audit findings indicate potential vulnerabilities in the data handling processes within several FlexPod deployments, raising concerns about data integrity and client confidentiality. Given the firm's commitment to the 500-170 FlexPod design framework, which of the following represents the most professional and compliant course of action? Option A. Prioritize cost-saving measures by delaying any remediation efforts until a more significant issue arises that necessitates immediate action. Option B. Disregard the audit findings as minor issues that do not warrant significant attention, assuming current processes are sufficient. Option C. Immediately implement a company-wide policy change to restrict all data access, regardless of the specific findings, to mitigate any potential risk. Option D. Conduct a detailed, framework-specific review of the audit findings to assess their impact on data integrity and confidentiality, followed by a targeted remediation plan if necessary. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed, framework-specific review of the audit findings to assess their impact on data integrity and confidentiality, followed by a targeted remediation plan if necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge because the audit findings, while identifying potential risks, are not definitive proof of noncompliance. The firm must balance the need to address potential issues proactively with the risk of overreacting, incurring unnecessary costs, or damaging client relationships. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the audit's implications for the firm's adherence to the 500-170 FlexPod design framework, specifically concerning data integrity and client confidentiality, which are paramount under regulatory guidelines. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based review of the audit findings in the context of the 500-170 FlexPod design framework. This means meticulously examining the specific areas flagged by the audit, cross-referencing them with the established design principles and controls outlined in the framework. The firm must then assess whether the identified issues, if unaddressed, could lead to actual breaches of data integrity or confidentiality, as defined by the framework and relevant regulations. This methodical approach ensures that any remediation efforts are targeted, proportionate, and directly address potential compliance gaps, thereby upholding professional standards and regulatory obligations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately implement broad, sweeping changes across all FlexPod deployments without a detailed understanding of the audit's specific findings or their potential impact. This is professionally unacceptable because it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to apply reasoned judgment. It risks wasting resources on non-existent or minor issues and could disrupt existing, compliant operations. This approach also fails to demonstrate a commitment to the principles of the 500-170 framework, which emphasizes efficient and effective design and management. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the audit findings entirely, assuming they are merely suggestions or minor oversights that do not warrant action. This is a severe ethical and regulatory failure. It directly contravenes the principle of continuous improvement and risk management inherent in any robust design framework, including 500-170. Ignoring potential risks to data integrity and client confidentiality can lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. It shows a disregard for the firm's responsibility to maintain secure and reliable systems. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the perceived cost of remediation without adequately assessing the potential consequences of inaction. While cost is a factor, it should not override the imperative to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and the integrity of the FlexPod design. This approach prioritizes short-term financial considerations over long-term risk management and ethical obligations, which is a hallmark of unprofessional conduct. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, thoroughly understand the audit findings and their specific context within the 500-170 FlexPod design framework. Second, conduct a risk assessment to determine the likelihood and impact of the identified issues on data integrity, confidentiality, and overall compliance. Third, consult relevant internal policies, the 500-170 framework documentation, and potentially legal counsel if the implications are unclear. Fourth, develop a targeted remediation plan based on the risk assessment, prioritizing actions that address the most significant potential compliance failures. Finally, document the entire process, including the rationale for decisions made, to demonstrate due diligence and accountability. Question 9. The evaluation methodology shows that a proposed FlexPod design has met all its stated performance benchmarks. However, during the final review, the compliance team has raised concerns about the data residency requirements for a specific customer segment, which were not explicitly addressed in the initial design documentation. The IT operations team has also expressed reservations about the complexity of the proposed management interfaces, fearing it will increase training overhead and potential for human error. Which of the following represents the most professional and compliant course of action? Option A. Halt the implementation and initiate a thorough review involving the compliance and IT operations teams to revise the design, ensuring data residency is addressed and management interfaces are simplified before proceeding. Option B. Inform the compliance team that the current design is sufficient and that their concerns are outside the scope of the initial performance-based evaluation. Option C. Implement the design as planned and provide separate, ad hoc training sessions to address the IT operations team's concerns about the management interfaces. Option D. Proceed with the current design as it meets performance benchmarks and address the compliance and operational concerns as post-implementation issues. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the current design as it meets performance benchmarks and address the compliance and operational concerns as post-implementation issues. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical juncture where a proposed FlexPod design must be assessed against its alignment with stakeholder expectations and regulatory compliance. The professional challenge lies in balancing the technical merits of the design with the diverse, and sometimes conflicting, needs and concerns of various stakeholders, including end users, IT operations, security teams, and compliance officers. A failure to adequately consider these perspectives can lead to a design that is technically sound but operationally unviable, insecure, or non-compliant, ultimately undermining its purpose and potentially leading to significant business and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a comprehensive stakeholder engagement process that actively seeks input, addresses concerns, and ensures the design meets the defined requirements from each relevant perspective. This aligns with best professional practice by fostering transparency, building consensus, and mitigating risks proactively. From a regulatory standpoint, this approach ensures that the design adheres to relevant data protection, security, and operational standards mandated by the governing bodies for the exam's jurisdiction. For example, if the jurisdiction mandates specific data handling protocols, involving compliance stakeholders early ensures these are embedded in the design. An incorrect approach that prioritizes only the technical performance metrics without considering operational impact would fail to meet the needs of the IT operations team, potentially leading to increased support costs or downtime. This is a professional failure as it neglects a key stakeholder group. Another incorrect approach that overlooks security requirements in favor of speed of deployment would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure, especially in jurisdictions with stringent data security laws. Such an oversight could expose sensitive data, leading to severe penalties and loss of trust. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the feedback from end users regarding usability would result in a system that is difficult to adopt, leading to user frustration and reduced productivity, a clear professional failing in user-centric design principles. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their potential interests. This is followed by a systematic process of gathering requirements and feedback from each group, evaluating the design against these inputs, and iteratively refining the design to achieve optimal balance. Regular communication and validation with stakeholders throughout the design lifecycle are crucial to ensure alignment, and to address emerging issues before they become critical. Question 10. System analysis indicates a client has expressed a strong preference for investing in a specific FlexPod product, stating it is what they want. However, preliminary information suggests this product may not fully align with the client's stated long-term financial goals and risk tolerance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Politely decline to discuss the FlexPod product and steer the client towards a different investment strategy that the advisor believes is more suitable, without further exploration of the client's initial preference. Option B. Immediately proceed with the client's requested investment in the FlexPod product, as client instructions are paramount and override any potential suitability concerns. Option C. Provide the client with a detailed fact sheet on the FlexPod product and allow them to make the final decision independently, without offering further advice or analysis. Option D. Conduct a thorough needs analysis and suitability assessment to determine if the FlexPod product, or other alternatives, are appropriate for the client's overall financial situation and objectives before making any recommendation. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough needs analysis and suitability assessment to determine if the FlexPod product, or other alternatives, are appropriate for the client's overall financial situation and objectives before making any recommendation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the client's stated preference for a specific investment product, while seemingly straightforward, may not align with their actual financial needs and risk tolerance. The advisor must navigate the tension between client autonomy and their fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. A failure to conduct a thorough needs analysis and suitability assessment before recommending a product, even one the client has expressed interest in, could lead to inappropriate investment outcomes for the client and potential regulatory breaches. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk profile before making any recommendations. This aligns with the core principles of client-centric advice and suitability requirements mandated by regulatory bodies. By conducting a detailed needs analysis, the advisor ensures that any proposed investment, including the FlexPod, is genuinely appropriate for the client's circumstances, thereby fulfilling their ethical and regulatory obligations to act in the client's best interest. This proactive and thorough process mitigates the risk of misaligned investments and potential client harm. An incorrect approach that involves immediately proceeding with the client's stated preference without further investigation fails to uphold the advisor's duty of care and suitability. This could lead to the client investing in a product that is too risky, not liquid enough, or otherwise unsuitable for their stated goals, potentially resulting in financial losses or an inability to meet their objectives. Such an action would likely be a violation of regulatory requirements concerning suitability and client best interest, exposing the advisor and their firm to disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach, which involves dismissing the client's preference outright and pushing a different product without understanding the client's rationale, demonstrates a lack of client engagement and respect for their input. While the advisor may have a different product in mind that they believe is superior, failing to explore the client's reasoning behind their initial preference prevents a collaborative decision-making process and could alienate the client. This approach also risks overlooking valid reasons the client might have for their initial interest, even if those reasons are not fully articulated. The professional reasoning framework to be employed in such situations involves a structured, client-centric process. First, actively listen to and understand the client's stated preferences and the reasons behind them. Second, conduct a comprehensive fact-finding exercise to gather all relevant information about the client's financial situation, objectives, time horizon, and risk tolerance. Third, analyze this information to determine the client's true needs and suitability for various investment products. Fourth, present a range of suitable options, explaining the pros and cons of each in relation to the client's specific circumstances, including the product the client initially expressed interest in, if deemed suitable after analysis. Finally, facilitate a joint decision-making process, ensuring the client fully understands the recommendation and feels confident in their choice. Question 11. Investigation of the implementation of a new FlexPod design within a financial services firm, where the primary objective is to enhance data processing speed and storage efficiency, without explicit consideration for the specific data residency and audit trail requirements mandated by the relevant financial regulatory bodies, which approach best upholds professional and regulatory obligations. Option A. Implement the FlexPod design based on general industry best practices for data storage and security, without specific verification against the firm's regulatory obligations. Option B. Rely on the IT team's interpretation of regulatory requirements, making implementation decisions based on their understanding without formal consultation with compliance or legal departments. Option C. Proceed with the FlexPod implementation focusing solely on technical performance metrics, assuming that compliance will be addressed as a separate post-implementation task. Option D. Prioritize a comprehensive review of all applicable financial regulations concerning data residency, security, and audit trails, and integrate these requirements into the FlexPod implementation plan from the outset. Correct answer is D. Prioritize a comprehensive review of all applicable financial regulations concerning data residency, security, and audit trails, and integrate these requirements into the FlexPod implementation plan from the outset. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexity of implementing a FlexPod design within a regulated financial environment. The challenge lies in balancing the technical requirements of the design with stringent compliance obligations, particularly concerning data integrity, security, and auditability. Misinterpreting or overlooking specific regulatory mandates during implementation can lead to significant compliance breaches, operational disruptions, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all technical decisions align with the overarching regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough review and understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically focusing on data handling, security controls, and audit trail requirements as mandated by the governing financial regulatory bodies. This ensures that the FlexPod design is not only technically sound, but also compliant from inception. By proactively integrating compliance requirements into the implementation plan, the organization mitigates risks of future remediation, avoids penalties, and maintains the trust of regulators and stakeholders. This aligns with the ethical obligation to conduct business in a manner that upholds legal and regulatory standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on achieving the technical performance goals of the FlexPod design without adequate consideration for regulatory implications represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This oversight can lead to noncompliance with data privacy laws, security standards, or reporting requirements, potentially resulting in fines, sanctions, and loss of operating licenses. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to prioritize the organization's legal and ethical responsibilities. Another incorrect approach involves deferring compliance checks to a later stage, such as post-implementation or during a scheduled audit. This reactive stance is professionally unsound because it increases the likelihood of discovering noncompliance issues late in the project lifecycle, leading to costly rework, project delays, and potential data breaches or security vulnerabilities that have already occurred. It signifies a failure to embed a culture of compliance and risk management throughout the implementation process. Finally, an approach that relies on assumptions about regulatory requirements or interprets them loosely without seeking clarification from compliance officers or legal counsel is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to unintentional violations of regulations, exposing the organization to legal repercussions and reputational damage. It highlights a deficiency in professional judgment and a failure to adhere to established best practices for regulatory adherence. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with implementing complex technical solutions in regulated environments should adopt a proactive and integrated approach to compliance. This involves 1. Early engagement with compliance and legal teams to understand all applicable regulations. 2. Incorporating compliance requirements as non-negotiable design and implementation criteria. 3. Conducting regular compliance reviews throughout the project lifecycle. 4. Documenting all compliance-related decisions and justifications. 5. Seeking expert advice when in doubt. This systematic process ensures that technical solutions are not only effective but also ethically sound and legally compliant, safeguarding the organization and its stakeholders. Question 12. What factors determine the most effective and compliant approach to optimizing processes within a FlexPod design environment, strictly adhering to the 500-170 FlexPod design exam's regulatory framework? Option A. The extent to which process optimization aligns with the specific data handling, security, and auditability requirements mandated by the 500-170 FlexPod design exam's regulatory framework. Option B. The speed at which process optimization can be implemented, prioritizing rapid deployment over a thorough review of potential compliance implications. Option C. The potential for process optimization to significantly reduce operational costs, even if it introduces minor deviations from established security protocols. Option D. The degree to which process optimization enhances system performance metrics, such as latency and throughput, irrespective of their impact on data integrity controls. Correct answer is A. The extent to which process optimization aligns with the specific data handling, security, and auditability requirements mandated by the 500-170 FlexPod design exam's regulatory framework. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because optimizing processes within a FlexPod design environment requires a nuanced understanding of both technical efficiency and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in balancing the drive for performance improvements with the strict adherence to the 500-170 FlexPod design exam's regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes data integrity, security, and auditability. A hasty or technically focused optimization without considering these underlying regulatory requirements could lead to unintended consequences, such as data breaches, non-compliance penalties, or compromised system reliability. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any process optimization enhances efficiency without jeopardizing the integrity or security of the FlexPod environment as defined by the exam's specific guidelines. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic view of process optimization, integrating technical performance with the explicit requirements of the 500-170 FlexPod design regulatory framework. This approach ensures that improvements are sustainable, compliant, and aligned with the overarching goals of data protection, system stability, and operational integrity. By focusing on understanding and adhering to the specific laws, regulations, and guidelines relevant to the exam's jurisdiction, professionals demonstrate a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory diligence. This proactive integration of compliance into optimization efforts mitigates risks and builds trust in the design solution. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on reducing latency without considering the regulatory implications of data handling would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to violations of data privacy laws or security regulations if, for example, data is processed or stored in a manner that is not permitted by the governing framework. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost reduction by implementing less secure or less auditable processes would also be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such actions could result in breaches of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, directly contravening the principles likely embedded within the 500-170 FlexPod design exam's regulatory context. Furthermore, an approach that bypasses established change control procedures for the sake of speed, without proper documentation and risk assessment, would undermine auditability and accountability, which are critical components of most regulatory frameworks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand the specific regulatory framework governing the FlexPod design environment for the 500-170 exam. Second, identify potential areas for process optimization. Third, for each potential optimization, conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that explicitly considers the impact on regulatory compliance, data security, and system integrity. Fourth, prioritize optimizations that offer the greatest benefit while posing the least regulatory risk. Fifth, implement changes through documented, controlled processes with thorough testing and validation. Finally, continuously monitor the optimized processes to ensure ongoing compliance and performance. Question 13. When evaluating the risk assessment approach for a new FlexPod design, Which methodology best ensures compliance with regulatory frameworks that emphasize proactive identification and mitigation of potential security and operational disruptions? Option A. A qualitative risk assessment that prioritizes risks based on expert judgment and historical incident data, followed by the development of tailored mitigation strategies. Option B. A quantitative risk assessment that assigns numerical values to the likelihood and impact of all identified risks, using statistical models to calculate potential financial losses. Option C. A risk assessment that focuses exclusively on the technical performance metrics of the FlexPod components, assuming that optimal performance inherently mitigates all other risks. Option D. A risk assessment that relies on a checklist of common IT vulnerabilities, without considering the specific context and potential impact on the FlexPod solution. The correct answer is A. A qualitative risk assessment that prioritizes risks based on expert judgment and historical incident data, followed by the development of tailored mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment methodologies within the specific context of FlexPod design, moving beyond a purely technical evaluation to incorporate regulatory compliance and ethical considerations. The challenge lies in identifying the most appropriate method for assessing risks that could impact the integrity and security of a FlexPod solution, ensuring it aligns with the regulatory framework governing such designs. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of potential threats and vulnerabilities. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and prudent risk management, expected under regulatory frameworks that mandate robust security and operational integrity for IT infrastructure. By considering both the likelihood and impact of identified risks, and then developing appropriate mitigation strategies, professionals demonstrate adherence to standards that aim to protect data, ensure business continuity, and maintain compliance with relevant laws and guidelines. This proactive stance is crucial for building trust and demonstrating competence. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the technical feasibility of a design without considering potential security breaches or operational failures would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for regulatory requirements that often mandate security by design and a comprehensive risk assessment process. Such an approach could lead to vulnerabilities that expose sensitive data, disrupt services, and result in significant financial and reputational damage, violating ethical obligations to protect client interests and potentially contravening specific regulatory mandates for risk mitigation. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past experiences without a structured, documented risk assessment process is also professionally deficient. This lacks the rigor and objectivity required by regulatory bodies and industry best practices. It fails to provide a clear audit trail or a defensible basis for risk mitigation decisions, potentially leaving the design susceptible to unforeseen threats. This can be seen as a failure to exercise professional skepticism and diligence, which are ethical imperatives. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This begins with identifying all potential risks relevant to the FlexPod design, including technical, operational, security, and compliance risks. For each identified risk, the likelihood of occurrence and the potential impact should be evaluated. Based on this evaluation, mitigation strategies should be developed and prioritized. This process should be documented thoroughly, providing a clear rationale for decisions and ensuring transparency and accountability. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment are also essential to adapt to evolving threats and operational changes. Question 14. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive assessment of new technology deployments. When considering the implementation of a FlexPod solution to enhance data processing capabilities, what is the most prudent approach to ensure regulatory compliance throughout the design and implementation phases? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of all applicable regulatory frameworks and consult with legal and compliance teams to ensure the FlexPod design incorporates necessary controls for data privacy, security, and retention before procurement and implementation. Option B. Rely on the vendor's compliance certifications for the FlexPod solution as sufficient evidence of regulatory adherence, without conducting an independent assessment of the organization's specific data handling requirements. Option C. Proceed with the FlexPod implementation based on the assumption that existing IT infrastructure compliance measures will automatically extend to the new system and address any identified gaps post-deployment. Option D. Prioritize the technical performance and cost-effectiveness of the FlexPod solution, deferring detailed regulatory compliance checks until after the system is fully operational and data migration is complete. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of all applicable regulatory frameworks and consult with legal and compliance teams to ensure the FlexPod design incorporates necessary controls for data privacy, security, and retention before procurement and implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a new IT solution with the imperative to adhere to established regulatory frameworks governing data handling and system design. The challenge lies in ensuring that the proposed FlexPod solution, while offering technical advantages, does not introduce new compliance risks or exacerbate existing ones. Careful judgment is required to identify potential regulatory pitfalls before implementation, rather than attempting to remediate them post-deployment, which is significantly more costly and damaging. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it proactively integrates regulatory compliance into the strategic planning and design phases. By engaging with legal and compliance teams early, the organization ensures that the FlexPod design aligns with all applicable regulations, such as those pertaining to data privacy, security, and retention. This demonstrates a commitment to responsible technology adoption and risk mitigation, which is a core tenet of professional conduct and a requirement under various regulatory regimes that mandate due diligence in system acquisition and deployment. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of deployment over regulatory review would fail to meet the due diligence requirements mandated by regulatory bodies. This could lead to violations of data protection laws, resulting in significant fines, reputational damage, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach, such as assuming existing compliance measures are sufficient without explicit verification for the new FlexPod environment, ignores the principle of specific compliance for new systems. This oversight could result in gaps in security or data handling protocols that are not covered by legacy controls, leading to non-compliance. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on technical specifications without considering the regulatory implications of data storage and access, demonstrates a lack of holistic risk assessment and a failure to uphold professional responsibility in safeguarding sensitive information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a risk-based approach to technology adoption. This involves identifying all relevant regulatory requirements, assessing how the proposed solution impacts compliance, consulting with internal legal and compliance experts, and incorporating compliance checks into the project lifecycle from inception to deployment and ongoing operation. This proactive and integrated approach ensures that strategic technology initiatives are not only technically sound, but also legally and ethically compliant. Question 15. Regulatory review indicates that the firm is developing a new financial product, the FlexPod, which requires a comprehensive client risk assessment. When onboarding clients for this product, what is the most compliant and ethically sound approach to collecting and handling client financial data? Option A. Limit data collection to only the absolute minimum required for account opening, even if it compromises the thoroughness of the FlexPod's risk assessment. Option B. Store all collected client financial data in an unencrypted format on a publicly accessible network to ensure easy access for the risk assessment team. Option C. Collect all available client financial data without explicit consent, assuming it is implicitly permitted for the purpose of risk assessment. Option D. Obtain explicit, informed consent from the client for the collection and processing of their sensitive financial data, clearly outlining its purpose for FlexPod risk assessment and management. The correct answer is D. Obtain explicit, informed consent from the client for the collection and processing of their sensitive financial data, clearly outlining its purpose for FlexPod risk assessment and management. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in interpreting and applying regulatory guidance on data handling and client confidentiality within the context of a specific financial product, the FlexPod. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for comprehensive client onboarding and risk assessment with the strict requirements for data minimization and secure storage, as mandated by the relevant regulatory framework. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure all necessary information is collected without inadvertently breaching privacy or security regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes obtaining explicit, informed consent from the client for the collection and processing of their sensitive financial data, specifically detailing how this data will be used for the FlexPod's risk assessment and ongoing management. This aligns with the principles of data protection and client trust, ensuring transparency and adherence to regulatory requirements that emphasize consent as a cornerstone of lawful data processing. By clearly articulating the purpose and scope of data collection, the professional upholds best practices in client relationship management and regulatory compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves collecting all available client financial data without explicit consent, assuming it is implicitly permitted for risk assessment. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for informed consent, potentially violating data privacy laws and eroding client trust. It demonstrates a lack of diligence in understanding the specific data protection obligations associated with financial products. Another incorrect approach is to limit data collection to only the absolute minimum required for account opening, neglecting the specific risk assessment needs of the FlexPod. While data minimization is important, failing to gather sufficient information for a proper risk assessment can lead to inadequate client suitability determinations, potentially exposing both the client and the firm to undue risk and violating regulatory obligations to act in the client's best interest. A third incorrect approach involves storing all collected client financial data in an unencrypted format on a publicly accessible network. This represents a severe breach of data security and confidentiality regulations, exposing sensitive client information to unauthorized access and potential misuse. It demonstrates a fundamental disregard for the security protocols necessary to protect client data. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements governing the product and client data. This involves identifying all relevant data points necessary for risk assessment and client suitability, then determining the least intrusive method of collection. Crucially, obtaining explicit, informed consent for any sensitive data processing is paramount. This process should be documented, and ongoing data security measures must be consistently reviewed and maintained to ensure compliance and protect client interests. Question 16. Stakeholder feedback indicates a client who has consistently expressed a desire for low-risk, capital preservation investments is now strongly advocating for a highly speculative, illiquid alternative asset fund. The client states they heard about this fund from a friend and are convinced it will provide exceptional returns, despite the fund's prospectus detailing significant volatility and a high probability of capital loss. The financial advisor has reviewed the fund's documentation and believes it is entirely unsuitable for the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Inform the client that while the fund is risky, it could be a good way to diversify their portfolio and proceed with the investment if they are insistent. Option B. Politely decline the client's request, clearly explaining that the proposed investment does not align with their established financial goals and risk profile, and present alternative suitable investment options that meet their stated objectives. Option C. Invest a small portion of the client's portfolio in the speculative fund to appease them, while investing the majority in more suitable assets and hope for the best. Option D. Agree to the client's request to invest in the speculative fund, as maintaining client satisfaction is paramount, and document the client's insistence on the investment. The correct answer is B. Politely decline the client's request, clearly explaining that the proposed investment does not align with their established financial goals and risk profile, and present alternative suitable investment options that meet their stated objectives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the ethical obligation to provide objective, unbiased advice. The financial advisor must navigate the client's emotional attachment to a specific investment, which may not align with their stated financial goals or risk tolerance, while upholding their fiduciary duty. The pressure to maintain the client relationship can create a temptation to acquiesce to the client's request, even if it's not in their best interest. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with professional integrity and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective assessment of the client's financial situation, goals, and risk tolerance, followed by a clear, evidence-based explanation of why the requested investment is unsuitable. This aligns with the core principles of fiduciary duty, which mandate acting in the client's best interest, prioritizing their needs above all else. It also adheres to regulatory requirements that demand suitability of recommendations and transparency in communication. By providing a reasoned explanation and offering suitable alternatives, the advisor demonstrates professionalism, upholds ethical standards, and builds long-term trust based on competence and integrity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately agreeing to the client's request without further investigation. This fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, as it prioritizes client appeasement over sound financial advice. It also violates suitability regulations, which require recommendations to be appropriate for the client's circumstances. This approach could lead to significant financial harm for the client and expose the advisor to regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without providing any explanation or alternative. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and professionalism, potentially damaging the client relationship. While it avoids making an unsuitable recommendation, it fails to educate the client and guide them towards better financial decisions, which is a key aspect of professional advisory. It also neglects the opportunity to understand the underlying reasons for the client's preference, which might reveal other unmet needs or misconceptions. A third incorrect approach is to subtly steer the client towards the requested investment by downplaying its risks or exaggerating its potential benefits, even if it's not fully suitable. This is a form of misrepresentation and a breach of ethical conduct. It violates the principle of honesty and transparency, and can lead to severe regulatory penalties and reputational damage. This approach prioritizes short-term client retention over long-term client well-being and ethical responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and underlying motivations. This is followed by an objective assessment of their financial profile and the suitability of any proposed investment. Crucially, professionals must be prepared to communicate their findings clearly and persuasively, even when it means delivering unwelcome news. This involves explaining the rationale behind their recommendations, addressing client concerns, and offering well-researched alternatives. Maintaining a commitment to ethical principles and regulatory compliance should be the guiding force in all client interactions. Question 17. Compliance review shows that a critical client reporting system is experiencing intermittent data corruption issues, potentially impacting the accuracy of regulatory filings. The IT team has identified a quick workaround proposed by the software vendor, but it has not been formally assessed against the firm's data governance policies or the specific requirements of the 500-170 FlexPod design regulatory framework. What is the most appropriate next step for the compliance officer? Option A. Initiate a formal risk assessment and impact analysis of the vendor's proposed workaround, consulting with legal and compliance teams to ensure adherence to all relevant regulations before any implementation. Option B. Advise the IT team to proceed with the workaround as recommended by the vendor, assuming the vendor's solution is inherently compliant with industry standards. Option C. Immediately implement the vendor's workaround to prevent further data corruption and address the immediate client reporting needs, with a plan to formally document and assess it post-implementation. Option D. Escalate the issue to senior management for a decision on whether to prioritize speed of resolution over a full compliance review. The correct answer is A. Initiate a formal risk assessment and impact analysis of the vendor's proposed workaround, consulting with legal and compliance teams to ensure adherence to all relevant regulations before any implementation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a solution with the long-term implications of a decision, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive client data and regulatory compliance. The pressure to deliver a quick fix can lead to shortcuts that violate established protocols and ethical obligations. The core difficulty lies in discerning between a pragmatic, compliant solution and one that prioritizes speed over thoroughness, potentially exposing the firm and its clients to undue risk. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a thorough, documented, and compliant resolution. This involves a systematic review of existing policies, consultation with relevant internal stakeholders, e.g., compliance, legal, IT security, and a clear understanding of the regulatory framework governing data handling and system changes. This approach ensures that any implemented solution is not only effective but also auditable, defensible, and adheres to the spirit and letter of the law, thereby protecting the firm and its clients from regulatory penalties and reputational damage. It aligns with the principle of acting with due diligence and care in all professional dealings. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that bypasses established change control procedures and directly implements a workaround without proper assessment risks, violating internal governance and potentially external regulations concerning system integrity and data security. This could lead to unforeseen vulnerabilities or data breaches, constituting a failure in professional duty of care. Another incorrect approach might involve relying solely on the vendor's recommendation without independent verification, or considering the specific regulatory context of the firm and its clients. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an abdication of responsibility, potentially leading to noncompliance if the vendor's solution does not meet the firm's specific legal and ethical obligations. A third incorrect approach could be to delay the decision indefinitely due to complexity, thereby failing to address a known issue that impacts client service or operational efficiency. This inaction, especially when a clear path to resolution exists through proper channels, can be seen as a dereliction of professional duty and may also have regulatory implications if it leads to ongoing noncompliance or service failures. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the problem and its potential impact. This framework should include 1. Information gathering. Collect all relevant facts, including technical details, client impact, and regulatory requirements. 2. Risk assessment. Evaluate the potential risks associated with different courses of action, considering both operational and compliance aspects. 3. Stakeholder consultation. Engage with relevant departments, e.g., compliance, legal, IT, business units to gather input and ensure alignment. 4. Solution evaluation. Assess potential solutions against established criteria, including compliance, security, efficiency, and cost. 5. Documentation and approval. Thoroughly document the chosen solution, the rationale behind it, and obtain necessary approvals before implementation. 6. Monitoring and review. Implement mechanisms to monitor the effectiveness of the solution and conduct periodic reviews. Question 18. Process analysis reveals that the selection of a FlexPod architecture for a critical business application is being debated among key departments. The finance department is advocating for the most cost-effective solution to minimize upfront capital expenditure. The application development team is pushing for a configuration that offers the highest performance and latest features to accelerate development cycles. The operations team is concerned about the manageability, scalability, and long-term supportability of the proposed solutions, considering the need for a robust and adaptable infrastructure, which approach best balances these competing stakeholder interests and aligns with sound IT governance principles. Option A. Prioritize the solution that offers the lowest initial purchase price, as determined by the finance department, to immediately reduce capital outlay. Option B. Select the FlexPod configuration that provides the most advanced features and highest performance, as requested by the application development team, to ensure rapid innovation. Option C. Conduct a thorough stakeholder analysis to identify all requirements and constraints. Facilitate a collaborative workshop to evaluate potential FlexPod configurations against these requirements, and reach a consensus-based decision that considers total cost of ownership, performance, and operational manageability. Option D. Choose the FlexPod design that the operations team deems easiest to manage and support with existing skill sets, regardless of performance or cost implications. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough stakeholder analysis to identify all requirements and constraints. Facilitate a collaborative workshop to evaluate potential FlexPod configurations against these requirements, and reach a consensus-based decision that considers total cost of ownership, performance, and operational manageability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in IT project management, where a critical design decision, the FlexPod architecture, has significant implications for multiple stakeholders with potentially conflicting priorities. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate cost savings desired by the finance department with the long-term performance and scalability needs of the application development and operations teams. Failure to adequately consider all stakeholder perspectives can lead to project delays, budget overruns, technical debt, and ultimately, a solution that does not meet business objectives. The need for a robust and adaptable infrastructure, as implied by the FlexPod design, further amplifies the importance of this decision. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive stakeholder analysis and a collaborative decision-making process. This aligns with best professional practices in project management and IT governance, which emphasize understanding and addressing the needs of all affected parties. Specifically, it adheres to the principles of ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technologies, frameworks, which are foundational for IT service management and governance. These frameworks advocate for aligning IT with business objectives and ensuring that technology investments deliver value. By engaging all stakeholders, gathering their requirements, and facilitating a consensus-based decision, the project team ensures that the FlexPod design chosen will be technically sound, operationally efficient, and financially responsible in the long run, minimizing the risk of costly rework or performance issues. This proactive engagement also fosters buy-in and reduces resistance during implementation. Incorrect approaches analysis. Prioritizing only the finance department's immediate cost reduction targets without considering the technical and operational implications represents a failure to adhere to sound IT governance principles. This approach risks selecting a solution that, while cheaper upfront, may lead to significant hidden costs later due to performance limitations, scalability issues, or increased maintenance overhead. This could violate the spirit of responsible resource management and potentially lead to a breach of service level agreements, SLAs, if performance is compromised, impacting business operations. Focusing solely on the application development team's desire for the latest, most feature-rich technology without a thorough cost-benefit analysis or consideration of operational support capabilities is also professionally unsound. This can lead to over-engineering, increased complexity, and higher operational costs that the organization may not be able to sustain. It neglects the financial constraints and the operational realities of maintaining the infrastructure, potentially leading to budget overruns and an inability to meet financial objectives. Ignoring the operations team's concerns about manageability, supportability, and existing skill sets in favor of a design that is difficult to implement or maintain is a critical oversight. This can result in prolonged downtime, increased support tickets, and a higher risk of security vulnerabilities due to inadequate patching or configuration. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence in ensuring the long-term viability and stability of the chosen solution, which is a core responsibility in IT infrastructure design. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with comprehensive stakeholder identification and analysis. This involves understanding their interests, influence, and potential impact on the project. Next, requirements gathering should be a collaborative effort, ensuring that technical, operational, and financial needs are documented. A thorough evaluation of potential FlexPod configurations should then be conducted, weighing the pros and cons against these documented requirements. This evaluation should include not just initial costs, but also total cost of ownership, TCO, including operational expenses, maintenance, and potential future upgrade costs. Facilitating open communication and negotiation among stakeholders is crucial to reach a consensus that balances competing priorities. If consensus cannot be reached, a clear escalation path and decision-making authority should be established, ensuring that the final decision is well documented and justifiable based on the overall business objectives and risk appetite of the organization. Question 19. Benchmark analysis indicates that a financial services firm is considering a FlexPod design to enhance its data storage and processing capabilities. The primary driver for this consideration is the potential for improved performance and reduced operational costs. However, the firm operates under strict regulatory frameworks governing data integrity, security, and auditability. Which of the following approaches best ensures that the implementation of the FlexPod design aligns with the firm's absolute regulatory obligations? Option A. Prioritize the performance and cost-saving benefits of the FlexPod design, assuming that the vendor's standard compliance certifications are sufficient for the firm's regulatory environment. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the FlexPod design's impact on existing data integrity, security, and auditability controls, validating its alignment with specific regulatory requirements before implementation. Option C. Rely on the IT department's general understanding of regulatory requirements to approve the FlexPod design, deferring detailed compliance validation until a specific regulatory inquiry arises. Option D. Implement the FlexPod design immediately to gain the performance advantages, with a plan to address any potential compliance gaps identified during post-implementation audits. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the FlexPod design's impact on existing data integrity, security, and auditability controls, validating its alignment with specific regulatory requirements before implementation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the implementation of a FlexPod design within a regulated financial services environment. The core challenge lies in balancing the technical requirements of a new, potentially more efficient infrastructure with the stringent regulatory obligations concerning data integrity, security, and auditability. The firm must ensure that any design choices do not inadvertently create compliance gaps or introduce new risks that could lead to regulatory scrutiny or penalties. The need for a robust and auditable system is paramount, especially when dealing with sensitive financial data. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the FlexPod design's impact on existing regulatory compliance controls. This includes verifying that the new design maintains or enhances data integrity, ensures appropriate access controls and security measures are in place, and supports comprehensive audit logging capabilities. Specifically, it requires confirming that the design aligns with relevant regulations such as those pertaining to data protection, e.g., GDPR if applicable to the jurisdiction, financial record-keeping, and cybersecurity standards. The emphasis on validating the design against specific regulatory requirements, rather than assuming compliance, demonstrates best professional practice. This proactive validation ensures that the implementation will meet legal and ethical obligations, safeguarding the firm from potential breaches and reputational damage. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to prioritize the perceived cost savings or performance benefits of the FlexPod design without a corresponding rigorous compliance review. This fails to acknowledge the absolute priority of regulatory adherence in financial services. Such an approach risks introducing vulnerabilities that could lead to data breaches, unauthorized access, or loss of data integrity, all of which are direct violations of numerous financial regulations and data protection laws. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on vendor assurances regarding compliance. While vendor certifications can be a starting point, they do not absolve the firm of its own responsibility to ensure the design meets its specific regulatory obligations within its operational context. This can lead to a false sense of security and a failure to identify unique compliance risks inherent in the firm's specific use of the technology. A third incorrect approach is to implement the FlexPod design with a plan to address compliance issues retrospectively. This is a fundamentally flawed strategy in a regulated environment. Compliance must be built into the design from the outset. Retroactive fixes are often more costly, less effective, and can indicate a disregard for regulatory requirements, potentially leading to fines and sanctions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this domain must adopt a risk-based approach to technology implementation, with regulatory compliance as a non-negotiable foundation. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the regulatory landscape. Clearly identify all applicable regulations and guidelines relevant to the firm's operations and the data being handled. 2. Impact assessment. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of how the proposed FlexPod design will affect existing compliance controls, data security, privacy, and auditability. 3. Validation and testing. Rigorously test the design to ensure it meets all identified regulatory requirements. This may involve specific compliance testing scenarios. 4. Documentation. Maintain detailed documentation of the design, the compliance assessment, and any mitigation strategies implemented. 5. Ongoing monitoring. Establish processes for continuous monitoring of the implemented system to ensure ongoing compliance. Question 20. Quality control measures reveal a potential for intermittent data corruption in a specific storage array within the FlexPod environment, identified as a low-probability, medium-impact event based on initial observations. The IT operations team has flagged this as a concern requiring attention. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Assign the issue to the lowest priority backlog item and revisit it during the next scheduled system review cycle. Option B. Immediately cease all operations utilizing the affected storage array to prevent any further potential data corruption until a permanent fix is deployed. Option C. Formally document the identified risk, conduct a detailed impact and likelihood assessment, and develop a phased mitigation plan with assigned responsibilities and timelines. Option D. Implement an ad hoc patch provided by a vendor without a formal risk assessment or integration testing to quickly resolve the observed issue. Correct answer is C. Formally document the identified risk, conduct a detailed impact and likelihood assessment, and develop a phased mitigation plan with assigned responsibilities and timelines. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge because the identified risk, while not immediately catastrophic, has the potential to impact the integrity and availability of critical FlexPod components over time. The difficulty lies in balancing the immediate resource allocation for remediation against the long-term, albeit less certain, consequences. A professional must exercise sound judgment to prioritize actions that align with business objectives and regulatory compliance without overreacting to every potential issue. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves documenting the risk, assessing its potential impact and likelihood, and developing a mitigation plan with defined timelines, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the principles of proactive risk management and due diligence, often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory frameworks that mandate robust IT governance and operational resilience. It ensures that risks are understood, managed, and that resources are allocated effectively based on a reasoned assessment, rather than ad hoc reactions. This methodical approach also supports auditability and compliance reporting. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately halt all operations and dedicate all available resources to an immediate, potentially disproportionate fix. This fails to acknowledge the nuanced nature of risk assessment, where not all identified risks require immediate, all-consuming attention. It can lead to inefficient resource allocation, disruption of essential services, and a failure to address other, potentially more pressing, risks. Ethically and regulatorily, this demonstrates a lack of proportionate response and potentially a failure to maintain business continuity by unnecessarily disrupting operations. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the identified risk entirely, assuming it will not materialize or is insignificant. This is a direct contravention of due diligence and proactive risk management principles. Regulatory frameworks typically require organizations to identify, assess, and manage risks to their operations and data. Ignoring a documented risk can lead to significant operational failures, data breaches, or service disruptions, resulting in regulatory penalties and reputational damage. It represents a failure to uphold professional responsibility for system integrity. A third incorrect approach would be to implement a quick, undocumented workaround without a formal assessment or mitigation plan. While seemingly addressing the immediate concern, this approach bypasses the critical steps of risk analysis and planning. It can introduce new, unforeseen risks, make future troubleshooting more difficult, and fail to address the root cause. Regulatorily, this demonstrates a lack of proper change management and risk governance, potentially leading to non-compliance with audit trails and security protocols. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured risk management framework. This involves 1. Identification, recognizing potential issues. 2. Assessment, evaluating the likelihood and impact of identified risks. 3. Prioritization, ranking risks based on their potential severity and urgency. 4. Mitigation, developing and implementing strategies to reduce or eliminate risks. 5. Monitoring, continuously reviewing the effectiveness of mitigation strategies and reassessing risks. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, proportionate, and aligned with organizational objectives and regulatory requirements.